Today we'll be creating a mobile app without writing a line of code using our Code AI. We'll use the cross-platform framework Flutter to make an app to remotely control smart televisions on the network. We'll name this application Remotely. To kick things off, we'll initialize a new Flutter app. Whoops! You can't create a Flutter app called Flutter. We'll create it and rename it. We've already created an R code configuration file that will ignore paths not pertinent to the logic of our new Flutter app. We've also created a folder called Reference containing the cloned repository Python Roku, a library for controlling televisions on your local network via Python. Now let's get started. We'll invoke R code from the command line and provide it our initial requirements. Our first prompt is as follows. Let's create a Flutter remote control app that lists the Roku devices on the network, then lets you select one to control, allowing you to turn up, down the volume, or press up, down, left, right, or OK on a specific selected device. You can use the provided reference Python Roku main for reference on how to do some of the Roku-specific operations in Python which you will need to port to Flutter. Our code will output a summary of settings and files to be included in the initial prompt, expected token usage, and a cost estimate. Given the model we're using and the files we're providing to start working with, it looks like this will cost a little less than a dime. A summary of changes and the complete contents of each changed file will be streamed back and printed to the console. It can be helpful to review the code as it is printed, but it's not necessary for the user to read or understand it. Once all the changes have been streamed back, you'll see a quick summary of which files should be updated and by how many lines. You'll see an updated token count and cost estimate and be presented with a series of options. Unfortunately, the model either didn't properly follow our code's instructions to output all file paths relative to the current working directory, or it didn't recognize that we had a Flutter app already initialized in the Flutter directory. We can set it straight with a simple follow-up prompt. I already have a Flutter app in the /Flutter directory. Can you add all of this to that, please? Modern frontier models are great at taking feedback like this, so even if it seems to have completely missed the plot on the first take, it is often worth taking a stab at nudging it back in the right direction. As we can see from the summary in its response, it does indeed understand that it needs to adjust the file paths it's outputting to ensure the appropriate files are written to. It can help to be extra clear about where any initialized projects are, or explicitly request modifications to certain files or folders. Now that the files it wants to write to are all properly pathed to the directory of our newly initialized Flutter app, we can write the change set to files and test the app. Let's open a new tab after writing the change set and change directory to our Flutter app so that we can issue a Flutter run to start the app. We can start by testing locally on macOS. You can also start a Flutter app on an iOS or Android device or emulator, or start it in a web browser. Flutter will resolve dependencies and fire up a dev build of our app to start testing which supports hot reloading. Flutter supports building a cross-platform app that generates native builds for macOS, Windows, Linux, iOS, Android, and web. Houston, we have liftoff. It's an app all right, but it doesn't seem to be detecting any of the televisions on the network. Not even when we click the refresh/rescan button. Let's hit it with a follow-up prompt. Back at our code, let's say, nice, this starts up and runs, but the select Roku device screen shows no devices and no errors are thrown/logged. Nothing changes when I click the refresh button. Maybe we need to add logging or take a fresh look at existing logic. You'll want to be clear with expectations and ensure any critical data points are relayed in the prompt. Keeping changes focused on a single area helps both ensure optimal results and bolster the ability to QA and provide feedback as the human in the loop. By adding logging, we'll be creating easily relayable signals from the app we're building for the model to work with. Even if we're unsure of why it's not working, or rather especially if we're unsure of why it's not working, letting it have a say in what to collect works wonders. Back to our changes. It's added some logging and error handling to the device discovery process. Let's write the change set to files and test it out. Pressing Shift-R will hot restart our Flutter app. Now we can see that our app is trying to discover devices but doesn't seem to be finding any. It seems to complete the discovery attempt fairly quickly, though. Let's follow up prompt with some of the details from the console. Okay, now it shows a message, no Roku devices found, and on the console, Flutter device discovery completed. Found 0 devices. When the Python Roku client is able to find devices on my network. Maybe it has something to do with this line in the console. Flutter, subnet, 192.168.1. And it seems to have spotted an issue with its subnet calculation with a proposed revision to address. Once again, we'll write the change set to files and reload our Flutter app. In retrospect, given the updates to PubSpec YAML, I should have run a Flutter pub get to update dependencies, which may have obviated some of the issues to come. That said, the practice of providing follow-up feedback with the text of any error messages you don't immediately have actionable context on can be productive. Yikes, that's a lot of error. Let's just copy it and feed it back in as a follow-up prompt. I'm pasting it into the address bar of a Chrome window and copying it back as a quick and dirty way to remove new lines from it so that it doesn't prematurely trigger our code. It's noticed the issue with the network info plus dependency and has an alternate way of managing the logic proposed using the Dart.io package instead. That should do the trick. We'll write the change set and try to start up the Flutter app again. The error we're getting seems to indicate our environment isn't in sync with dependencies and we should try running pod install. But when we try to do that, it doesn't seem to exist in our current directory. At first, I decided to try feeding this error back in as a follow-up prompt as well. This change updated the relevant pod file and a couple other files, as well as provided some instructions on next steps. As usual, we'll write the change set and hop back to our Flutter app. It's the same error. We clearly need to track down this pod file so we can properly pod install. We're trying to run on macOS, so that's our culprit. A quick change of directory and pod install should do the trick. It updated successfully, so that seems positive. Let's try to build our app again. And it works. The app runs and it successfully detects the devices on my network. Let's see if it controls the televisions. It does indeed. From the console, I can see the 200 code successful responses. And though you can't see it here, it did in fact control the selected television as expected. Now I want to add the rest of the buttons on my remote. What I have so far is nice, but I want things like the home and back button as well. As a follow-up prompt, I say nice. It works. So now let's just add some more buttons. Back, home, power, rewind, fast forward. I would later add image input support to our code, and the models available today do increasingly good work at converting a JPEG or PNG into a fully fleshed out layout in code. While it works on that, let's get this project added to a Git repo. Iteratively staging and being able to revert atomic changes can be critical with holistic AI-driven development, as it is frequently valuable to redo an ineffective prompt or change. When working with holistic code generation today, it is often helpful to keep each change request focused enough to represent a single commit, although that doesn't mean you need to commit with each written change set. Let's write the change set to files and check out what it looks like in source tree. This seems about right. Let's reload our Flutter app and confirm. Perfect. It has all of the buttons we asked for, and they all work as expected. Let's add some key binding so that we can use the keyboard to control a few common commands if we're using the desktop build of the Flutter app. It's a helpful feature, and it'll make our evaluation process of the app quicker. Our prompt is, "This is looking pretty solid. A few more tweaks, please." Let's add hotkeys so that if the app is open and a device is selected, when a user presses a hotkey corresponding to an action/button, it is sent. Here are hotkeys. Arrow keys should operate like arrow keys on the remote. Enter should act as OK. Backspace should act as backspace. We'll also stage the previous changes while that works so that we can isolate them from subsequent changes. You don't need to create a commit with each iterative change, but it doesn't hurt to stage things incrementally as you build and test them. You know the drill by now. We're going to write change set to files and reload our Flutter app. Select a device again and test a button press as well as the keyboard, and it works! Let's follow up to make some quick layout changes and say, "This is great, now just put the volume up, down, and mute buttons on their own row below the arrow buttons." Also, can you implement the button on the Roku remote that does the 10-second rewind? The one that looks sort of like a back button, but with a loopy arrow. While these systems appreciate precise details, documentation, and official nomenclature, they are shockingly adaptable to meeting you where you are. So try not to overthink it and feel free to be casual. We'll write the change set and reload our Flutter app. Wow! Not only has it implemented the buttons and layout adjustments we requested, it's also updated to use some slick standard icons rather than text for the buttons. This sort of proactive overachiever behavior by default is not uncommon of modern frontier models, and you can prompt to encourage or discourage it based on your needs. So far, everything we've built we have run on macOS. Next time, we'll wrap up core functionality and styling as we run the app on mobile. You can find the link to that video in the description.